Hi everyone! Today I want to talk to you about interaction styles within the MBTI framework or the 16-type framework, and how we can use this model created by Linda Berens in order to better understand other people and in order to better collaborate and communicate with other people, especially in the workplace. Because I find that this theory, although it can be very useful in personal relationships, it applies very, very well to professional situations, professional roles, collaborations, meetings, and so on and so forth. So in Linda Berens' model, there are 5 main interaction styles. I've talked about this in different videos. I've mentioned it with respect to, different MBTI type comparisons, but I just want to briefly go through this again. So the first one is called the in charge or the control interaction style. Here we have ENTJ, ESTJ, ESTP, and ENFJ. Then we have the finisher group or the chart the course group, where we have INTJ, INFJ, ISTJ, and ISTP. Then we have the starters or the get things going interaction style, where we have ENFP, ENTP, ESFP, and ESFJ. And lastly, we have the behind the scenes interaction style that comprises of INTP, ISFP, ISFJ, and INFP. Now, these 4 interaction styles are characterized by different ways of interacting with other people, different ways of communicating, and somewhat different needs, especially when it comes to working on something. Let's start with the in charge or the control group. So we have mainly the EJs here, with the exception that instead of ESFJ we have ESTP. These types are extroverted and they are also direct or directive. And this means that in their communication style, they prefer to kind of stick to the point. If they give you an answer to something, or if you talk to them about something, their preference is for things to be clear, direct, to the point, rather than kind of beating around the bush and going into too many details. They are people who prefer being clear-cut about things, and they kind of have this expectation from others as well. So particularly in the workplace, because due to their, in control kind of preference, they very, very often end up in leadership positions, manager positions. Their interaction style predisposes them to being very good at getting things done through other people and achieving things that are realistic. So they kind of have a very good sense of what would be a realistic thing to achieve together with the group that I'm leading. And sometimes that can be a formal leadership position, sometimes not. But generally speaking, they don't tend to idealize results as much as other types, and they're also not quite as perfectionistic in most cases. I'm not saying 100% of situations, but in most cases they have a better sense of what would be an achievable thing to do together with this group. So something that's very important with people from this group is, especially if you're working with them in a company or in a project, to try to be direct yourself, to try to stick to the point yourself and not waste their time with conversations that are too long. Of course, there will be exceptions, but generally speaking, this is something they tend to care a lot about. So if you have a meeting with them, try to prepare in advance to think about what you want to tell them, what the key points are that you want to share with them, what the key questions are, and try to summarize the information as much as possible, because they will really appreciate it. And I also noticed that this tends to be a common pattern or a common theme with them. They tend to be quite annoyed if people are late at meetings or in different situations where you have to do something together. They are quite sensitive to that, and are more likely to perceive it as a sign of disrespect if you are late. Whereas perhaps other types, especially the starter types or the behind the scenes types, they are not quite as sensitive to that. Also, something that's really important with the in charge or control group is that you are able to respect the fact that they like to make decisions. Even though they will often say like, yeah, I want to hear your input, or I want to hear what you have to say, they tend to be quite stubborn about the decisions that they want to make, especially at work. And they might be a bit more sensitive than the other types at being patronized or other people telling them what to do. I mean, most people don't really like being told what to do, but especially with the control types, they are very sensitive to that and can get quite upset. And if they are in a managerial position where they have the formal authority to make decisions, they might get even more upset than in other contexts. Now, moving on to the chart the course or the finisher group. So again, here the pattern pretty much is the IJ types, with the exception that we don't have ISFJ, we have ISTP instead. And as well, INTJ, INFJ, and ISTJ. These people are introverted and they are also direct or directive in their communication style. So this part is similar to the first group, where their communication preference is to kind of direct the conversation in a certain direction rather than to ramble and give too many details or too much context. They are also more likely to prefer to the point, succinct, clear, summarized responses to things, and might be a little bit shorter in their speech, in their presentation, as compared to the informative types that we will talk about soon. Now, when it comes to interacting with people with this style, something that you will notice, especially in the workplace, is that they care a lot about taking things to completion. That's why they're called finishers. Here we have a bit of a stronger tendency to look at an idealized outcome or the ideal result, the desired result, more so than the achievable, realistic result, like I mentioned for the control types. So they are not as good at sensing what is the most realistic, achievable outcome, but they have a tendency to think more in terms of what is my desired outcome in this situation and how can I get there. And they are really good at staying consistent to getting to that particular result. And they don't really like to kind of lead or control other people, but sometimes if they have to, they have the ability to also help other people stay on track to reach those particular desired outcomes or goals. Now, the thing with this interaction style is sometimes they can be a little bit rigid because they want that thing and they're heading towards it. They maybe idealize that desired result, and sometimes they might not have enough flexibility to change that based on different inputs that they get from the external world. And here I'm talking particularly about INTJ, ISTJ, INFJ. With ISTPs, I notice a bit more flexibility due to the P part, but still. Now, I also feel like mentioning a disclaimer here. This is a personal observation. People with this style sometimes have the expectation that in all situations they will be very good at finishing things and that they will always complete everything, especially if they hear about this theory. Sometimes certain things, like for example having ADHD, which is separate from personality type, might cause someone to have more difficulties with taking things to completion. But we're talking more about what the natural preference is, although sometimes behaviorally more work needs to be done to develop this skill. Okay? Now, back to our conversation topic. What to do when you interact with these people in the workplace? It's actually very important to respect the fact that these types will want to take things to completion, and the fact that they tend to take their tasks and their responsibilities and their duties very seriously. So if you're working with them, it's a good idea not to give them too many different things or to change your projects and your expectations too much, because this will really frustrate and overwhelm them. Of course, sometimes you need to, and that's fine, but try not to overdo it, because it will put them under a lot of stress and then they will also not really perform at their best. It's also important to be prepared and to be on time. Similar to what I said about the control types, here we also have a preference for being on time, sticking to deadlines, having clear expectations, being prepared for meetings rather than having meetings that take much too long, because of this preference for the direct style of communication. But they tend to be a bit more patient as compared to the control types if other people are late. And I would say this is because of the introversion. Now, the next group, we have the starters or the get things going style. Mainly the EP types, and again we have the exception of we don't have ESTP, we have ESFJ instead, and then the other EP types. Here we have extroverted people with a preference for an informative style of communication. So this means that they really enjoy starting new projects, they enjoy starting new things, and their communication tends to be broader. They don't like direct, succinct communication as much, at least in their own style, but rather they tend to give more information, more detail, more context. They are more likely to ramble or to jump from one idea to the other one, because in their minds, it feels like it's important to cover all that ground to help other people understand what they have to say. They are also really good at coming up with new exciting ideas and getting other people excited about this as well. And this is why we have a lot of starter types who become entrepreneurs, freelancers, they start startups. I know so many ENTPs particularly, but also ESFPs and ENFPs who start new companies, who have ideas for new projects, and they are also really good at making other people excited to join them in those endeavors. They are probably the most spontaneous out of all the types, the most likely to have the initiative to create something new. Their difficulty usually tends to lie in the fact that they don't always have the ability to take things to completion, because they get bored. They don't really want to focus on all the details that need to be done or cared for in order for those things to happen. So sometimes they need the help of a finisher or a control type to actually get things done in the long run, because they might have a lot of enthusiastic energy at the beginning of a project or at the beginning of something new, where they get a lot done, but in time they tend to get a little bit bored and distracted, and they want to start something new. So if you're working with them, it's really important to show them appreciation for their ideas, because they care so much about those new ideas that they come up with that, you might not implement all the new ideas that they have, but showing respect and showing appreciation for what they came up with is really important to them and will make them feel valued. Another thing here I would say is, because they are informative types, they prefer to have longer introductions, or if you have a meeting with them, a conversation with them. As compared to the other two groups that I talked about earlier, these people need to have a longer period of time where maybe you do a bit of small talk, a bit of warm up. You kind of, create space for a more personal, informal conversation. Whereas the other two tend to like to get to the business or to get to the point faster. I've seen this in groups that I've worked with as a facilitator, that the starter types, they tend to get a lot of happiness and energy if the trainer creates energizing activities at the beginning. And this is not something I'm very good at. I tend to also prefer to get to the point. And I notice that in order to make people with this personality preference feel included and feel happy and feel like they're thriving in the group, it's really important to create space at the beginning for more conversation, more informal activities, more warm-up, more getting in touch and connecting with other participants as well. Okay, and lastly, we have the behind-the-scenes group, so mainly the IP types, with the exception that we don't have ISTP, rather we have ISFJ, and then the other three IP types. Now here, the preference is to get the best result possible. So out of all the types, I would say the IPs are the most perfectionistic of all types, even though it might not necessarily always be obvious to other people. And they also have an informative style of communication. So similarly to the starters, they also prefer to be able to give more context, more details, to make sure that other people understand what they're trying to say. They might also ramble a bit more or jump from one idea to the other more than the types who have a direct style of communication. So at the workplace, people with this interaction style, I've noticed they tend to be a little bit slower at the beginning. Let's say they have a new job, or they're starting working in a new department, a new field, a new industry. At the beginning, they tend to take a little bit longer compared to other types to get into the flow of doing things or to get results. And that is because they spend a lot of time wanting to understand things properly, wanting to do things really well. This is where their perfectionism can come into play. However, in time, they can be the people that have the best skills and the best results because they have invested so much time into learning and perfecting what they're already doing. And I've noticed a clash, because this is very, very common. We have ENTJ, ESTJ, ESTP, like manager or CEO of a company. And then we have the INTP, ISFJ, ISFP, or INFP, who's an employee. And sometimes the control type, who's a manager or a leader, they feel like the behind the scenes type is not getting enough done, or they're not fast enough at performing or having good results, especially from a KPI perspective. And then this can create conflict, and the manager might put even more pressure on the behind the scenes type, which can really overwhelm the behind the scenes type. And I think this is a really important awareness to have. If the behind the scenes types are supported and are given a little bit of time and patience, they can thrive and they can be some of the most dependable employees or team members. But because they are a bit more reserved sometimes and not so extroverted, this can also cause some misunderstandings. And that's why I think that this theory can be so helpful. Also, it's important, like I said, for the starter types, same thing applies to the behind the scenes types. They also prefer to have a bit of a longer time to warm up, to have informal conversations. They don't always like the meetings to be so direct and to the point. They might need a little bit more time to get used to it, to connect to other people. They might not be quite as talkative as the starters because of the introversion, but still, that's something that tends to make them feel comfortable. So it might be something to take into account if you're working with them. So these were my thoughts on the 4 interaction styles and what are some of the things we can pay attention to if we're working with them in the office or in any kind of, professional activity. Some of these things will also be helpful for personal relationships, but I find that for work, this is particularly helpful. I hope this was insightful, interesting, helpful for you. And as always, thank you very much for being with me. Thank you very much for watching this video, and see you next time with another video on typology.